On January 4th, 1894, the temperature in Harlan County, Nebraska, was 11 below zero at first light, and Hannah Broderick was outside with a crosscut saw by 7 in the morning. She had 12 pieces of green cottonwood to notch, a frozen ground she could not penetrate past 4 inches in 11 days before. The last of her salted pork would begin to turn in the cold room. The cold room was a corner of her root cellar that did not hold cold reliably in January, because its walls were sod and sod-breathed, and when the temperature swung, as it did in Nebraska, from 11 below to 34 above and back inside of a week, the pork sweated and soured at the margins in ways that a family of 3 could not afford to ignore. She needed a smokehouse. She had needed one for 2 years. Nobody had built it for her. Hannah was 36 years old, a widow since the autumn of 1892. When her husband Conrad had been struck and killed by a falling elm, he was clearing from the east field. She had buried him in October and then kept the farm running through that winter and the next on the labor of herself, her 14-year-old son Peter, and her 9-year-old daughter Ruth. The farm was 80 acres of creek bottom and upland mixed, a modest operation by the standards of the county, adequate by the standards of a woman keeping it alive alone. Adequate, again, being the word that described the minimum necessary and nothing beyond it. What Hannah had brought to Nebraska from Pennsylvania was not just a Methodist upbringing and a set of cast-iron pans. Her father, Ernst Keller, had been a smokehouse builder, not exclusively but prominently. He had built 11 smokehouses across Lancaster County over a 20-year span, structures of varying size and sophistication but consistent in their basic engineering, and he had built most of them with Hannah at his side from the time she was 8 years old. Not as an assistant who handed tools, as an apprentice who was expected to understand why each decision was made and to be able to explain it if asked. Ernst Keller was not a sentimental man, and he was not ahead of his time in any social sense, but he was a craftsman who believed that understanding crossed gender without difficulty, and he had taught his eldest daughter with the same rigor he would have applied to a son. By the time she was 16, Hannah could frame a smokehouse from memory. By 18, she had helped build 3 from foundation to ridgeline. By the time she left Pennsylvania for Nebraska at 22, she had absorbed a body of practical knowledge about wood, smoke, heat distribution, and food preservation that most people in the Nebraska settlement had no framework to recognize as expertise because it was held in a woman's hands. The settlement at Harlan County in the early 1890s was not hostile to Hannah Broderick. It was, on the whole, reasonably kind in the way that isolated agricultural communities are kind, practically when someone needs a hand, with appropriate limits when the need begins to press on principle. The limits that pressed on principle in this case were about winter construction in general, and about what a single woman could accomplish in that construction specifically. The person who first said it plainly was Josiah Crane, age 64, the county's most experienced builder. He had constructed more structures in Harlan County than any other person: barns, cabins, a grain elevator, a one-room schoolhouse, 2 churches. And he had done it over 22 years of homestead-era building in conditions that had educated him comprehensively about Nebraska winters. He was not a cruel man. He was a specific man. When Hannah mentioned the smokehouse at the general store in late December 1893, Crane was present, and he said what he thought, which was that January was not a workable month for solo construction, and that the foundation problem alone, frozen ground preventing proper post setting, made the project inadvisable until March at the earliest. "The ground won't take posts in January," he said. "Not properly. You can toenail sill plates to surface timbers, but in a thaw-freeze cycle, the whole thing walks. By April, you'll have a leaning smokehouse." It was a legitimate concern. In Nebraska's January, with its volatile temperature swings, Any structure relying on posts set in frozen earth was genuinely vulnerable to frost heave, the expansion and contraction of soil moisture that could, over the course of a few freeze-thaw cycles, tilt a post foundation measurably in any direction. Crane had seen it happen. He had repaired the results. His objection was not dismissive. It was informed. What he did not know, because Hannah had not told him and had no particular reason to, was that she had already solved this problem before he raised it. The design she had worked out in November, sketched on paper bags by lamplight while Peter and Ruth slept, did not use posts set in the ground. It used a continuous sill frame, a four-sided foundation of hewn timber laid flat on the surface, pinned at the corners with iron drift pins, driven horizontally through the overlapping joints and anchored to the earth by 4 iron stakes driven at 45-degree angles through holes bored in the outer sill members. The stakes were not set in the ground for structural depth. They were set at angles to prevent lateral drift. Vertical loads would be carried by the sill frame, distributing weight across its full footprint, eliminating the point load vulnerability of posts. The system was adapted from a technique her father had used for outbuilding construction on the saturated creek-bottom soils of Lancaster County, where post-rot and heave were chronic problems, and surface frame construction had become the preferred solution for anything not requiring deep anchor strength. A smokehouse required no deep anchor strength. It required a platform that didn't move, walls that held smoke, and a roof that vented it correctly. Surface frame construction on frozen ground, if the frame was properly weighted and pinned, would hold through Nebraska's January temperature swings with acceptable movement, less than a quarter inch over the 11-day construction window she had planned. She knew this because she had done the arithmetic and because she had watched her father do it on similar soils. She told none of this to Josiah Crane. She thanked him for his concern and went home and began cutting timber the following week. The second voice of community skepticism was Martin Valls, age 47, a German-born farmer who had the adjacent property to Hannah's east and who was, in most respects, a decent neighbor. He had helped her bring in the hay the previous August when Peter had been sick, and she was genuinely grateful for that. When he saw her hauling the cottonwood lengths to the proposed building site on January 3rd, he walked over with the good intentions of a man who intends to help and arrived with the manner of a man who assumes that help is needed because competence is absent. "Cottonwood is a poor choice for a smokehouse," he said, looking at the stack. He was not wrong about cottonwood in general. It was considered a second-tier construction wood, prone to warping and faster to decay than oak or elm or even pine. It'll open up in the first hard spring, and you'll have gaps in your walls letting the smoke out. Hannah had chosen cottonwood for 3 reasons. First, it was what she had. Her property's creek bottom held abundant cottonwood and minimal hardwood, and buying milled lumber from Alma would have cost approximately $6 for the quantity she needed, which she did not have. Second, cottonwood, when properly prepared for smokehouse use, was not as poor a choice as its general reputation suggested. A smokehouse is not a dwelling. It does not need to hold against wind loads for decades. It needs to hold smoke, shed rain, and survive a reasonable number of years with maintenance. Third, and this was the reason she didn't share with Voles, cottonwood's specific porosity, the reason it was considered inferior for general construction, made it a modest asset in a smokehouse wall. It breathed slightly. The same quality that caused it to check and warp in dry conditions allowed the wall to participate marginally in moisture management during a long smoke, drawing excess moisture outward rather than allowing condensation to pool at the base of the interior wall, which was a chronic problem in tight-built smokehouses and a cause of off flavors in cured meat. Her father had used cottonwood for 2 of the 11 smokehouses he built. She had watched him do it, She knew what to watch for. "It'll serve," she told Voles. He shrugged and went back to his property, which in the social grammar of the county meant he had registered his objection and absolved himself of further responsibility for the outcome. The third skeptic was not a neighbor, but a woman, Edna Staples, age 51, who ran the county's informal social infrastructure through the simple mechanism of knowing everyone's business and commenting on most of it without malice. She found Hannah at the general store on January 5th, the second day of construction, and asked directly how the building was going, in the tone of someone who has been briefed and has concerns. "January is no month to be outside all day," Edna said. "Not at your age, not alone. If you take sick, who looks after Peter and Ruth?" It was the most pointed concern anyone had raised, and the most personal and the hardest to dismiss, because it was true. Hannah was 36, healthy, strong from 4 years of frontier farming, but not invulnerable. If she developed the lung fever that could follow sustained cold weather exertion, the kind that had taken 2 settlers in the county in the previous 2 winters, the children would be in serious difficulty. She had thought about this. She had calculated it the way she calculated the structural problems, honestly, without sentimentality. The counter-calculation was also honest. If she did not build the smokehouse, the pork she had put up in October would be seriously compromised by mid-January. Compromised pork, fed to children over a Nebraska winter with no alternative protein supply readily available, carried its own health risks. The choice was not between risk and safety. It was between 2 kinds of risk, and she had chosen the one she could manage through skill rather than the one she could only endure through luck. She explained this to Edna in brief terms. Edna listened without interrupting, which was not her default mode. "You've thought this through," Edna said, which was both an observation and a concession. "I have," Hannah said. Edna did not become an advocate, but she stopped being an obstacle, and in Harlan County in 1894. That was a workable position. The construction began in earnest on January 4th. The smokehouse she had designed was modest by the standards of the Lancaster County structures she had learned on. 8 feet by 10 feet in plan, 7 feet to the ridge, with a single door on the south face, no windows, and a rack system of iron hooks on horizontal rails that could hold approximately 360 pounds of hanging meat at full capacity. The firebox was an exterior pit, not inside the structure, which was the simpler approach but which created temperature control problems, but offset 6 feet to the northeast, connected to the smokehouse interior by a buried clay and stone conduit through which the smoke traveled to cool before entering the chamber. Cooled smoke deposited its volatile compounds on meat surfaces more efficiently than hot smoke, which passed through too quickly. Her father had used the offset firebox on 4 of his 11 structures, always for long cures rather than quick smokes, and had explained the physics to Hannah when she was 12 years old, crouched beside him as he laid the conduit stones. The surface sill frame went down on January 4th and 5th. She had pre-cut the sill timbers in December, 4 by 6 inch hewn cottonwood, each piece approximately 10 feet long, and stored them in the barn where they had partially dried in the relatively warmer air. Setting them required leveling the site, which on frozen ground meant tamping a layer of clean sand she had stockpiled in the barn since October into a flat bed roughly 12 feet square. The sand leveled the surface without requiring ground penetration and provided a frost-resistant bearing surface that would compress slightly under load, but not heave. It was a trick her father had used on the Lancaster County clay soils. It worked on Nebraska's frozen ground line with the same logic. The frame was square within a 1/4 inch across both diagonals by the end of January 5th. These are the kinds of practical solutions that disappear completely from history when nobody takes the time to document them. Real problems, real answers, real people, in real cold. If this account is resonating with you, subscribe and leave a like. It matters that these stories find an audience. The wall framing went up on January 6th through 8th. She used a modified post and rail system, not traditional balloon frame, which required more precise milled lumber than she had access to, but a system of rough-sawn corner posts notched at regular intervals to accept horizontal rails. The rails themselves notched at the ends to key into the post channels. The notching was the slow work. Each notch required a saw cut and a chisel cut in wood that was stiff with cold and resisted the chisel with the particular stubbornness of green cottonwood below freezing. Her hands, even in doubled mittens, lost feeling in the outer fingers every 40 minutes, and she built a small fire of scrap wood at the worksite, burning it in a clay pot she had brought from the house to warm her hands at intervals. Peter helped on January 6th and 7th, not with the framing, which required cuts she didn't trust him to execute yet, but with the material handling, carrying, positioning, holding pieces while she cut and fitted. He was a quiet boy with good spatial instincts who understood that being useful meant following instructions precisely rather than improvising, which made him a better construction helper than most adults she had worked beside. By the end of January 7th, all 4 walls were framed to the plate height of 6 feet 6 inches. The roof went on January 9th and 10th. The ridge board, a single piece of 2x6 that she had milled from a straight cottonwood section using a draw knife and a considerable amount of January 3rd, sat in notched brackets at the gable ends, and from it she cut and fitted 12 pairs of rafters at a pitch of 6 and 12, steep enough to shed heavy snow, but not so steep as to make the peak unworkable as a smoke collection point. The peak had a continuous vent gap of 1.5 inches running the full 8-foot length of the ridge, covered by a simple cap of overlapping shingles that admitted no rain, but allowed convective smoke escape at a controlled rate. She had shimmed the cap angle 3 times before she was satisfied with the gap dimension. A gap too wide cooled the chamber too fast in January. A gap too narrow allowed creosote to build on the interior surfaces at a rate that would require cleaning after every 3rd use. 1.5 inches. She had measured it with a stick she'd cut to length and kept in her coat pocket. The sheathing, horizontal 1x boards of rough-sawn cottonwood, applied with deliberate 1/4-inch gaps at the bottom of each course to allow that slight breathing the cottonwood's porosity enabled, went on January 10th and 11th. She worked alone on those 2 days, Peter being needed at school, and she finished the last board at 4:17 in the afternoon on January the 14th, which was the 11th day from her first cut. She went inside, built up the stove, put a pot of dried bean soup on the heat, and sat at the table while her hands thawed and wrote in the household ledger, "Smokehouse complete. Interior dry, ready for curing, 11 days. The first smoke ran on January 16th. 48 hours after completion, she gave the green cottonwood walls 2 days to settle and equilibrate to the ambient temperature before introducing heat, which reduced the risk of stress cracking in the new wood. She burned apple and hickory chips she had sourced and dried the previous autumn, set in the exterior pit, and ran the smoke through the conduit for 4 hours at a temperature she estimated, by touch on the interior wall and the color and density of smoke at the vent gap, at between 90 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit inside the chamber. The pork shoulder she had hung first, 16 pounds, lightly salted, emerged after 6 hours with the characteristic mahogany surface and the clean, settled smell of properly cold smoked meat. Josiah Crane came to see the finished structure on January 19th, brought by Martin Voles, who had apparently been watching the construction from his east-facing window with the focused attention of a man revising his position on something. Crane walked around it twice before he went inside. He spent approximately 12 minutes examining the construction, the sill frame pinning, the notched rail system, the offset firebox and conduit, the ridge vent gap. He said nothing for the first 10 minutes. When he came out, he asked her about the sand bed under the sill frame. She explained it. He asked her about the conduit slope. She had set it at a 3-degree downward angle from firebox to chamber, so condensation in the conduit ran back toward the firebox rather than pooling at the chamber entrance. She explained that too. He asked her where she had learned the offset firebox design. "My father built 11 smokehouses in Lancaster County," she said. "I helped with most of them." Crane stood looking at the structure for a moment. It was a good structure. Tight, square, properly vented, more sophisticated in several details than anything he would have designed for the same purpose and budget. He was a man who had built 22 years of structures in Harlan County, and he recognized good work by the same instinct that recognizes a well-sharpened tool by its feel. "The sand bed was smart," he said. "I wouldn't have thought of that for this ground." It was the most Josiah Crane had ever said in praise of another person's construction in recorded county memory. Martin Voles, who was present for the exchange, did not dispute it. The smokehouse that Hannah Broderick built in January 1894 served her family for 7 years before she sold the property in 1901 and moved with Peter and Ruth to Lincoln. The family that bought the farm, the Grubers, husband Otto and wife Clara and 4 children, used it for another 14 years until 1915, when the offset firebox conduit developed a crack that Clara Gruber documented in a letter as letting the cold back in. They patched it with clay and mortar and used the structure for another 3 years after that. The construction technique she had applied, surface frame on sand bearing with angled anchor stakes, offset firebox, cottonwood sheathing with graduated gaps, was not published anywhere or codified in any manual. It was demonstrated and then examined and then replicated in the way that practical knowledge replicates in isolated communities. By watching, by asking, by the simple force of the visible result. If you followed this story all the way to its end, it tells me something about what kind of history you think matters. Please take a second to like this video. It genuinely helps this account reach people who want to find it. By 1897, 3 years after Hannah finished the smokehouse in 11 January days, there were 4 offset firebox smokehouses in Harlan County. 2 of them had been built by men who had examined Hannah's structure. One had been built by a woman, Agnes Voles, Martin's wife, who had drawn her own plans in February 1895 and executed the construction with her teenage son over 8 days in March. Agnes Voles had never spoken directly to Hannah about the design. She had simply looked at the structure carefully on 2 visits in the winter of 1894 and taken her own measurements with a string. That is how most practical knowledge has always moved. Not through publications or patents or formal instruction. Through the examination of things that work, by people willing to learn from what they see. The smokehouse, as a structure, as a technology, has a history as old as any human technology for which we have evidence. The preservation of meat through cold smoke appears in archaeological records across northern Europe from at least 3,000 years ago, and the basic engineering challenge, how to deliver cool, dense smoke to a hanging surface without cooking the meat, has been solved independently and convergently by cultures separated by oceans and centuries. The Sami reindeer herders of Scandinavia developed tent-formed smokehouses of birch pole construction and hide sheathing that used the same offset smoke principle as Hannah's conduit, routing smoke through a low channel before it rose into the preservation chamber. The Haida people of the Pacific Northwest built cedar plank smokehouses with elevated chambers and adjustable vent boards that permitted the same smoke temperature management that Hannah had calibrated with a shimmed ridge cap and a measuring stick. The colonial-era smokehouses of Virginia and the Carolinas, The brick and timber structures that still stand on restored plantation properties use separate firebox structures connected to the main chamber by covered walkways, the distance itself serving as a cooling mechanism. Every one of these solutions is a different answer to the same physics problem. Smoke carries preservative compounds in proportion to its density and temperature. And dense, cool smoke deposits those compounds on meat surfaces more efficiently than hot, rushing smoke. Slow it down, cool it, give it time to work. The specifics vary by climate, material, culture, and the particular mind that worked it out. The underlying principle holds everywhere. Hannah Broderick had learned it from her father on the creek-bottom soils of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and she had carried it across the full width of the continent and pressed it into frozen Nebraska ground with iron stakes in a hand she had sharpened before dawn and 11 consecutive days of January cold. The smokehouse stood for 17 years. The knowledge it embodied has no expiration date.